Let's do a quick sort of overview on the two different ways in which living organisms can reproduce. So during sexual reproduction, you have two parents that help to give rise to an offspring that has a unique combination of genes that have been inherited from both of the parents. On the other hand, in asexual reproduction, a single individual passes on all of their genes, or their entire genome, to the offspring without any fusion of gametes. So the entire genome comes just from that one single parent. And what this creates is essentially a clone of the original parent. And so the way that we technically define a clone is that it's a group of genetically identical individuals that all arise from the same parent organism, parent cell, for example. So there's no genetic diversity at all whatsoever in that group of cloned individuals. Now, if we were to go back now and talk a little bit more about sexual reproduction, let's talk about how both fertilization and this process of meiosis alternate in sexual life cycles. So on this particular slide, we've got an example of the human life cycle. And life cycle, remember, is going to be this generation to generation sequence of stages in the reproductive history of an organism. And so you can see we've got an adult male and female. Each one carries their respective reproductive organs. You've got the ovaries in the female, the testes in the male. Ovaries give rise to the egg, testes the sperm. And the production of those gametes happens during this process of meiosis, right? So in the female, meiosis produces haploid egg cells. And in the testis, meiosis produces haploid sperm cells. An egg and a sperm from two individuals are going to come together during fertilization to create a diploid zygote. That diploid zygote, having two sets of chromosomes, then will continue to divide using mitosis, and the organism will go through development to create, again, adult diploid mature organisms. Now, just to review some of the terms that we've used in that previous slide. So for example, first of all, fertilization. This is the union of gametes that takes place during sexual reproduction. So this is where the sperm and the egg come together and they fuse. This produces a cell that's called the zygote. This is the fertilized egg. The zygote is that first diploid cell of an organism. It has two sets of chromosomes. One set was inherited from each parent. So one set came from the egg, one set came from the sperm. And from here, the somatic cells are going to be produced. So the zygote is going to go through mitosis to create now genetically identical daughter cells that will go through development to create the new, if it's a multicellular organism, the new multicellular organism. In meiosis, remember, this is where you have this special cell division which produces the gametes. And the gametes, remember, have only half the number of chromosomes as the original parent cell. So gametes only have one set of chromosomes. And again, just to refresh, gametes are going to be the sperm and egg depending on whether you happen to be a male or a female. Now, the key thing to note in a sexual reproductive life cycle is that fertilization and meiosis alternate, right? So you're going to have meiosis creating haploid gametes. The gametes come together during fertilization to create a diploid zygote, which develops into a new organism. Cells in this new organism will go through meiosis to create haploid egg and sperm, which again come back together during fertilization to create a new diploid zygote, which will develop into a new organism. And this process will continue over and over again, alternating meiosis, fertilization, meiosis, fertilization. So you're going to have the number of chromosomes in meiosis, bring them back together in fertilization. Have them in meiosis, bring them back together in fertilization. Now, not all sexual life cycles are the same. And so just very briefly, we're going to go through some of the differences that we have in the ways in which the life cycle sort of progresses in different kinds of organisms. So one key point, though, is that in all of the sexual life cycles we're going to talk about, there's always an alternation of the having of sets of chromosomes in meiosis and the doubling of sets of chromosomes in fertilization. The life cycles, they just differ in how these processes of meiosis and fertilization are timed. So we've got down here the 3 different kinds of life cycles we're going to talk about. The first one, this is where the organism spends the majority of its time in the diploid stage. And the middle life cycle, here we have a 50-50. So half the time the organism is in the haploid stage, half the time it's in the diploid stage. And then the last option here for the third sexual life cycle, the organism spends the majority of its time in the haploid stage. All right, so let's do animals first. We're most familiar with these. We've already kind of gone through it, right? So in animals, gametes are the only haploid cells that ever exist, right? So your sperm and egg, as a human, this is the only time that your cells exist with only one set of chromosomes. So the gametes are produced during meiosis, and they come together during fertilization. They create that diploid zygote, which then develops into a diploid multicellular organism. And again, some of the cells in that diploid multicellular organism can then create new gametes via meiosis. That's in animals. Plants and algae are a little bit different. They have what is called an alternation of generations. So one generation is diploid, and the next generation is haploid, and then they go back to being diploid. And so if we were to start, let's say down here in the diploid stage, you can have a diploid multicellular organism that's called a sporophyte. And the sporophyte, that's very similar to an adult human, let's say. And cells within this sporophyte will go through meiosis to create haploid cells. Now, in animals, those haploid cells would immediately be the gametes. But in the case of plants and some algae, these haploid cells are called spores. And the spores, something kind of interesting, the spores can actually grow into a multicellular organism that's called a gametophyte, right? So plants, some algae exist some of their time as a diploid multicellular organism, but they can also exist as a haploid multicellular organism, which is really kind of, interesting to think about. And so from here, if these cells within the haploid multicellular organism, which is called a gametophyte, were to give rise to gametes, they can't go through meiosis again, right? Because the cells already only have one set of chromosomes. You can't split that again. And so in this case, mitosis will create the gametes. The gametes then come together during fertilization to create the zygote, which is a diploid cell, and that will develop again into a diploid multicellular organism. And so in this case, you've got an organism that spends part of the time as a haploid multicellular organism and half the time as a diploid multicellular organism. All right, and then lastly, fungi and protists. Again, in animals, we spend the majority of our time as diploid organisms. Fungi and some protists, they actually are the opposite. They spend the majority of their time as haploid organisms. So the only time they're ever diploid is that single cell stage, that's the zygote. As soon as the zygote is formed, immediately goes through meiosis to have the number of chromosomes again. So meiosis produces these haploid cells, and these haploid cells, depending on the organism, might stay unicellular or it might develop into multicellular haploid organism. From here, then, because the cells are already haploid, in order to produce the gametes, the cells will simply go through mitosis to create genetically identical cells with only one set of chromosomes, and the gametes then can come back together through fertilization to create, again, that diploid zygote that immediately will go through meiosis again. Right, so for fungi and protists, they spend the majority of their time in the haploid cell stage. So what I want you to take home from this discussion of different sexual life cycles is that depending on the type of life cycle, either haploid or diploid cells can divide by mitosis. This is definitely something that is kind of unique, and we haven't really addressed this in humans because it doesn't happen in humans. So maybe let's take a little bit of time to review. Okay, so we talked about mitosis, right? So in mitosis, we are creating genetically identical daughter cells, right? So if you start with a diploid cell, you're going to end up producing genetically identical diploid daughter cells. That's what happens in animals. There are other organisms, as we have just seen, plants, algae, protists, fungi. You can also take a haploid cell and allow that to go through mitosis, creating, again, genetically identical daughter cells. And you are going to end up with, if you start out with haploid, you end up with haploid daughter cells. This can also happen. This is the way that the gametes are produced in the other sexual life cycles. Now, for meiosis, it's a little bit different. In meiosis, because your whole point of meiosis is to have the number of chromosomes, you have to start with a diploid cell. There's no way around that, right? You need two sets, because what's going to happen, and I'm kind of oversimplifying this particular figure, is you want to have the number of chromosomes in those daughter cells, so each daughter cell only gets half the original that the parent cell had, which means that the parent cell had two sets. The daughter cells only have the one set. All right. So we covered the first 2 points, right? Depending on the type of life cycle, either haploid or diploid cells can divide by mitosis. However, only diploid cells can undergo meiosis, right? Because that's the process that halves the number of chromosomes. And then in all three of the life cycles that we talked about, this halving, meiosis, and doubling, fertilization of chromosomes, contributes to genetic variation in the offspring, because you never have the same set of chromosomes coming back together during fertilization. It's always a different set from two different parents.